Good morning. Yikes. How is everyone this morning? Doing all right? Enjoying summer still, right? Yeah? My name's Brian. It's my privilege to share God's Word with you this morning. So if you have a Bible, well, that's on a device or hard copy, we are going to be in 2 Kings chapter 4. Do you ever just go out like for a walkabout around town and not really have any plan, or agenda or even timeline, but you just kind of go for a little wander about to see what is going on, praying maybe as you go, listening to the Lord, asking the Lord to kind of show you, some things as you go about the place. I went for a little walkabout the other afternoon and just praying and asking the Lord to show me as I went, and didn't have far to go before, after I'd left our apartment, the first thing he showed me was this woman on the other side of the street. And she was struggling up the pavement carrying this big cooler, right? And she would struggle and have to put it down and then pick it up again and struggle on for a few more feet and put it down. And I was on the other side of the road. And I saw this younger guy walking up behind her, right? And I thought, oh, well, surely he's going to help her. And he walked up behind her, and he walked right around her, and he kept on walking on up the pavement. And I thought, wow. So anyway, I crossed over the road and said, well, would you like a hand with that cooler? And she did want a hand, and we carried it 50 yards up the road. She was going to a park, and she was getting ready for a company picnic. And I said, well, you must have drawn the short straw to carry this by yourself. Maybe next time you should make sure you delegate to make sure you have people with you, right, to carry that stuff. So that was number one thing that I observed on that afternoon. And then I walked further, and I came downtown, and I was down in the southwest area down there by McCormick and Schmidt's. Do you ever go down there? There's some benches down there, and you can sit, and you can look out over the river, right, and the marina down there. And I was just sitting and reading and praying. It's a nice shady spot. And I watched this boat come in, and there was a family on the boat, and the mother and the child got out, and they disappeared, and the dad was busy tidying up the boat, obviously getting ready to put it away, and there was a son, and he was just sitting in a seat, and I thought, well, why isn't he helping his dad? That's odd, right? Probably just on his phone, that was my initial reaction. And then I looked a bit closer, and I could see him rocking backwards and forwards in his seat, I thought, oh, he must have some kind of disability. And sure enough, a bit later, Mum and the other child reappeared with a wheelchair, and the dad got out this whole boom apparatus thing. It was really cool, and he slotted it into the side of the boat, and there was this arm and chair, and picked his son up and swung him out over back onto the dock, and sat the son down in the wheelchair, and off they went. And it just occurred to me, the effort that they went to keep their son in community with them as a family. Because they could have just left him at home, I imagine, and found someone to look after him, and that would probably been a lot easier, right? But instead, no, they'd gone to all this trouble to make sure that they could take their son out, and so they could, as a family, as a community, enjoy their time on the boat. And just how those two things contrasted with each other, right? There was this young bloke who just walked right past this woman struggling with a cooler, and this other family that went to all the effort. And how easy it would have been for God to leave us, right? Struggling up the roads of our lives, carrying our whatever it is, the weight of our sin, and he could have just by and left us, to do it yourself, right? You brought it on yourself, you take care of that. But that's not what God does. And even though we can't help him tidy up anything, he has to do that. He does that for us. And Jesus did that for us when he went to the cross and he died on the cross and he paid for our sins in full. He did that. He swung us into his loving arms. so that we can be in community with him. And now we stand in this gap of time and space, and we get the opportunity not to do the same thing as God, but we can act in his place, right? If we have our eyes and ears and minds open to the opportunity that God provides around us. Because there are gaps that we can stand in and make a difference. And that's what we're looking at this morning. We're in this series called Standing in the Gap, and we're looking at the prophet Elisha, and he was called to stand in the gap of his time. And we're going to read now 2 Kings 4:38 through 44. Julia's going to come up and read that for us.
And Elijah came again to Gilgal, where there was a famine in the land. And as the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, he said to his servant, "Set on the large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets." One of them went out to the field to gather herbs, and found a wild vine, and gathered from it his lap full of wild gourds, and came and cut them up into the pot of stew, not knowing what they were. And they poured out some for the men to eat. But while they were eating of the stew, they cried out, "O man of God, there is death in the pot." And they could not eat it. He said, "Then bring flour." And he threw it into the pot and said, "Pour some flour for the men that they may eat." And there was no harm in the pot. A man came from Baal Shalisha, bringing the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley, and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And Elisha said, "Give to the men that they may eat." But his servant said, "How can I set this before 100 men?" So he repeated, Give them to the men that they may eat. For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left. So he set it before them, and they ate and had some left, according to the word of the Lord.
Perfect. Thanks, Julia. You know, we've already looked at a couple of stories where Elisha did things for people. In fact, he did miraculous things for people. There was a woman who was in desperate need because her husband had died, and she had this massive debt that she couldn't afford to pay off, and the creditor was coming to take her 2 sons, and Elisha provided this abundance of olive oil that she could go and sell and pay off her debt and have enough to live on after that. Last week we looked at a woman whose husband was old. She had a reasonable amount of money, and she was stable where she lived, but she didn't have a child. And Elisha promised her a child, and lo and behold, she had a child. And then that child grew, and that child died. And Elisha brought that child back to life again. So we've already seen him do these miraculous things. And there's one thing about the miracles, it's like they're done in community. You know, I suppose you could do miracles, you know, out in the desert, in the wilderness by yourself, but nobody would see that, right? Because there's actually a point to miracles. They point to something, and they point to God. Jesus, of course, did lots and lots of miracles, but he did them for a reason, and the reason pointed about who he is and also who he points to, his Father. I think about Elisha, and of course he followed the prophet Elijah, who was a great prophet, and Elijah himself did some miracle stuff, right? He miraculously provided food for a woman. He brought a child back to life as well. He had that great victory over the prophets of Baal, but Elijah was kind of a loner, wasn't he? And he kind of did things out on his own, and not to say that that was bad, that was his calling in life. But Elisha, on the other hand, we see that he actually lives his life in community. He lives his life in 3 kinds of communities, actually, from what I see. In the community of other prophets, that he's around quite a bit in the community of his country. He's involved in Israel. And in a larger community, he's also involved in nations outside of Israel. And the more community I think that we live in, the more opportunity it provides for us to do miracles. Jesus, of course, after his baptism, he called disciples. He formed a community. Did Jesus have to do that? Well, not particularly, right? He could have just done it all himself, right? He didn't need his disciples at all, but he called them because he wanted to show them what it meant for them to stand in the gap of community, what that was going to look like. And again, as I said, Jesus, of course, did so many miracles, and a lot of them were analogous to Elisha's. And you might think, well, yeah, Brian, but that's really easy for Jesus to do all those miracles because, after all, he's God in the flesh, so that's not a problem for him. And Elisha had asked for this double portion of the Spirit, and which clearly he'd got, so it wasn't a problem for him. But me, well, what am I supposed to do? Except, as we've talked about this before, we're filled with that same Spirit. The same Spirit that Elisha had, the same Spirit that was in Jesus, the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the grave. Guess who's in you? The Holy Spirit. That same power that can perform the same miraculous things. But maybe we just need to kind of tweak our idea of miracles a little bit here this morning. Because I think if we stand in the gap in the life of community, we can touch community in miraculous ways. 3 things I think this passage shows us. The first has to do with contamination. Elisha, he goes to Gilgal. They're making a stew. Who doesn't like stew? It's tasty stuff. The thing about stew is you can chuck just about anything in it, right? And it's still tasty, isn't it? And so one chap goes out and he finds these gourds on a vine. Oh, they go nice in my stew. So he puts them in his bag and back to the pot, right? Chop, 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 into the pot. Let it simmer there for a few hours, and then in the evening they dish it out for supper, right? And they're all sitting there. Oh, this is nice, isn't it? Lovely. Except one of the prophets then, goes, hold on a sec, what's this? One thing when you have other people's stew, it's always best actually never to ask, what is that? Unless you really want to know, because sometimes you just might not want to know. But I can just picture in my scene, right, that this one prophet, what is this? And this one prophet who found the gourds goes, oh yeah, they're great. These gourds I found on this vine, right? And, I couldn't believe no one's already picked the gourds, because notice in the text it says there's a famine on. I can't believe nobody's spotted that vine and picked those gourds already. And the other one goes, well, yeah, actually there is a reason. They're poisonous. And you just contaminated our whole stew. Anyone ever had food poisoning? Yeah, someone? Yeah. It's not that nice, I don't think. I don't know that I ever really had it myself. But I remember this incident from a long time ago. And we were out for a birthday dinner. It was actually my birthday, my family. And we went to this restaurant, and just to cut a long story short, we were eating, and we'd had the first course, and we started in the second course, and my dad starts going, oh, feel a bit off. I just go off to the loo, and I'll be back in a minute. Well, he disappeared, and he never came back. And we finished our main course, and we were into our desserts, and I went back to the loo to see what was going on, and I found him lying out going, oh, and he was just white as a sheet, I said, wow, Dad, you look terrible. Just trying to be encouraging as I could for him. And he's, I'll be all right in a minute. So we went back and finished our desserts and had some coffee, and still he hadn't appeared. and went back again, and he looked even worse by that time. It's like, oh, wow, he really is bad. And so I had to ask the owner of the restaurant to ring for an ambulance, and he wasn't very keen to do that, right? But eventually he had to, and the ambulance came, and they carried Dad out through the restaurant on a stretcher. I tell you, watching people's faces, fellow diners, as they were putting their forks to their mouth, and if you want to see how contamination breaks community, that was it, right there. And I kind of put it to you this morning that that's kind of happening all around us, because there's a lot of stuff that's contaminated, that's toxic even, that we're ingesting on a daily basis, sometimes without even realizing it, right? It's just out there. It's just all kind of thrown into the pot. And maybe we're not that discerning about what we're eating sometimes, or what we're listening to, or what we're watching. James, he talks about it, and he talks about one particular thing of the body that is especially contaminating, and that is the tongue. He says, it is a restful evil full of deadly poison. It's contaminating. Some of the words that we hear, some of the things that we get to listen to, it's all just kind of thrown into the pot, and we just dish it out and start eating away, and some of it is just toxic, isn't it? Now, I know that toxic sometimes is a word that's a little overused today. Perhaps we have toxic, I don't know, toxic environments and toxic leadership and toxic masculinity and toxic institutions. There's toxic religion too, right? And in all those instances, in fact, there is evidence of toxicity, right? That there definitely have been toxic things that have just been thrown into the pot, and people have been hurt and poisoned because of that, because they've ingested those things. And they don't want to go near it ever again, right? Why would you? We narrowed it down for my dad that, it was the mussels that he ate. And guess what? He never ate mussels ever again. You couldn't tempt him with another mussel, even 30 years afterwards. And that's the same with us too, right? Sometimes we have been poisoned in some people, unfortunately, even in church. And they won't have anything to do with it because it hurts so bad. And it made them so sick. And some toxicity is deliberate too. You know, that's kind of one of the oldest forms of murder, in fact, that people use, right? They got a little poison, some hemlock or whatever it was, and into somebody's supper, right? And then they snuffed it, and they couldn't be traced back to them, except that is possible now. But as I said, like the whole toxicity thing, I mean, it has become a bit of a just broad label today. In fact, I was reading a tweet of a woman the other day, and she said that freedom of speech itself is toxic. It's like, and here's what she meant, is that, in other words, you're likely to say something which I don't agree with, and so therefore that's toxic to me. You know, contamination is in all of us, because we're all contaminated with sin. In some ways, we're all toxic, right? That's our very problem, is that we are all toxic, and nothing destroys community more than sin. Sin absolutely destroys community. We think about the very first sin with Adam and Eve, and what was the first things they started saying? Adam started saying things about God and about Eve, and Eve about the snake, and and it just absolutely destroys community when our language is toxic. when we enter into gossip, when we enter into slander, when we enter into boasting, all these kinds of things. So what is the antidote? There was an earlier story with Elisha that we didn't read, but it's kind of along the similar vein, that he went to this town and the water for the town was bad, and they complained to Elisha about it, whether he could do something, and he took some salt and he threw it into the water, and he made it better. In this case, he took some flour and he throws that into the stew, and he makes it better. I don't know about Jesus throwing flour into a stew. We don't have any story about Jesus doing that. But he did talk about his disciples, about them being the salt of the earth. You are the salt of the earth, he said to his disciples. In other words, what Jesus is saying is that we are the antidote to the contamination that is going on in the world. Because with our words and our actions, we can point people to God. Which is kind of a miraculous thing, isn't it? In this day and this age, that if we really are the salt of the earth with our words and all the contamination and toxicity that is going on, we can point people to God. But we need to be careful. Because Jesus also gives a warning when he says that his disciples are the salt of the earth. He says, but if salt loses its saltiness, then it's really good for nothing. And it's so easy for us in this environment, in this toxicity of sin, because we live in a sinful world, right? For us to lose our saltiness if we're not very careful, if we don't remain plugged into Jesus Christ himself. Paul tells the Colossians, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. So we can stand in the gap in our community and be the antidote to toxicity when we are the salt of the earth. Secondly, we can also point past scarcity. Second bit that Julia read for us is that this man comes from a town and he brings 20 barley loaves that he presents to Elisha, and Elisha tells the man to feed the prophets, right? There's 100 prophets, and the man protests and says, no, I can't do that. That's not nearly enough for to go around. And Elisha insists and says that the Lord has told him that there will be plenty. Elisha just kind of sees things differently, right? He sees past the scarcity. Another thing I noticed in my wandering around Portland downtown is there's just kind of a scarcity of people, isn't there? I don't know if you've wandered down there much, but it seems like there's a scarcity. And in fact, it doesn't just seem like it. I saw there was a study the other day, and it said that Portland is only like 41% back to where it was pre-pandemic, number of people-wise. It's like the third lowest in the nation. There is a scarcity. And we tend to focus on scarcities, don't we? Do you remember, like, when the pandemic kicked off? What was the one item that was so scarce right at the very beginning? Do you remember? Loo paper, that's right. You were going to Costco or Freddy's or somewhere, the shelves were like bare, not a sheet of loo roll to be found anywhere, right? Was there a shortage? I don't know. Well, there certainly was a shortage after everybody started focusing on it, wasn't there? And rushed off to the shop and grabbed as many loo rolls as they could possibly carry out. And that's what we do, right? When we think scarcity, we think hoarding, and we just got to get mine and take it away with me, and I'm not going to share none of that. And that's what we focus on. When we look at this miracle of Elisha, feeding a large number of people out of few resources. Does that make you think of anybody else by any chance? It does, doesn't it? It makes us think of Jesus, who hundreds of years later, not only just did he do it once, but he did it twice. And he didn't just feed 100 people, right? He fed 5,000 and 4,000, and that was just the men. So there's probably a lot more people than that when he performed that miracle. And you may remember the first time that Jesus did that, when he fed the 5,000, that he'd gone away with his disciples because John the Baptist had just been beheaded, and he'd heard about that, and it'd been such a busy time, and Jesus just wanted to get away with his disciples to get some respite. And so they sailed off down the lake, and he had in mind this kind of deserted place, right? Be nice, just go and relax and chill. But when he got there, unfortunately, everybody else had sussed out where he was going, and they got there first. And he pulled ashore and looked, and there was this massive crowd, right? And he could have said, "Oh, no, lads, let's just go further." But he didn't do that, did he? It says, in fact, he looked at them, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he ministered to them all day long, healing and teaching, and just worked with them all day long. And then it started to go into evening, and the disciples started going, getting a bit late, isn't it? You know, shops are going to be shut, Subway's going to close pretty soon, we're out here in the middle of nowhere. Jesus needs to send these people away so they can go and eat, right? And they go to Jesus and tell him. In fact, it's in the imperative in the Greek. They command Jesus, you need to send these people away now. See, they're so focused on the scarcity, aren't they? But Jesus, like Elisha, he sees things differently. And he tells them, you feed them. And then I love in John's gospel, you know, Philip's there doing a little calculation. 200 denarii of bread. Yeah, it's not going to happen. Not going to work, right? Not going to make it. And then there's Andrew, and he finds this boy with 5 barley loaves and a couple of fish, and he's kind of chuffed with himself that he's done that. And, you know, brings him to Jesus. And look, I found this lad with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. And then he looks around at the crowd and goes, oh yeah, I feel really stupid now. Because that's so little compared with so much, right? And he looks again at the scarcity. And it's so easy for us, isn't that, to look at what we don't have. You know, we can go outside and down here in Old Town and all around Portland and look at the scarcity. It seems overwhelming, doesn't it, the needs around here? Absolutely overwhelming. And what can we, as just a few people, as a small church, what could we possibly do here in the face of such odds? And the problem is when we think like that is that, again, like the disciples, we are focusing on the scarcity, and we're not focusing on God. And we're not focusing on what Jesus wants to do, and we're not focusing at what he has at his disposal, right? The riches of God, the indescribable riches of God that surpass anything that we can possibly imagine. There is no scarcity with God. The God who created the heavens and the earth and the universe and everything that we see, there's no scarcity mindset with God. All he wants is for us just to bring what we have and give it to him. After Jesus had fed the 4,000 and he'd had this kind of exchange with some Pharisees, and Jesus and his disciples are in a boat and they're going somewhere, And Jesus is talking about, warning them about the leaven of the Pharisees, in other words, warning them about the teaching of the Pharisees. And the disciples go, oh, he's having a go at us because we haven't brought any bread with us. And they start having this discussion about how Jesus is upset because they haven't bought any bread, and what are they going to do, and what are they going to eat, you know. It's just so funny in my mind, you know, that they're sitting there having this discussion. And Jesus, of course, knows what they're talking about. He goes, what are you banging on about? Don't you remember the number of baskets you picked up, you know, of leftovers after I fed the 5,000? They go, oh, yeah, 12 baskets. And after the 4,000, oh, yeah, there was like 7 baskets. Do you think we're going to run out of bread? No. Again, you see how easy it is. Even when we know what Jesus has done for us, we know what Jesus can give us, and yet still we can fixate on the scarcity, can't we? I was at a funeral yesterday for a man who I greatly respected, a wonderful, wonderful Christian man. He was wise, he was humble, and there was a time in my life where life was really not going well, and it was hard and it was difficult. In fact, all I could see was like scarcity. And just so easy to focus on that scarcity. And Clint, he just took my mind and he helped me refocus not on the scarcity, but on the riches of God. And what Christ could do through me still if I would just offer what I had to him. And he made such a tremendous difference in my life. He pointed me miraculously to God. And that's what we can do when we stand in a community that is all about so focused on scarcity. We can miraculously point people to God and say, yeah, never mind that. Let's look at God. Let's look at what God can do. And we can encourage people just like Clint encouraged me. So don't let scarcity define us. Paul, writing to the Romans, says, he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? He's done the greater thing for us, right? Why would he withhold the lesser from us? Contamination, scarcity, and the last one is reliance. So there's a story that we didn't read here this morning, but we're going to do it anyway. It's just a really quick story. Again, Elisha is in community. He goes out with the prophets. They're going to go and build a bigger house because the house they have is too small. And so they go out to chop down some trees to make some logs, and they do it by the Jordan River. And this one prophet, he's borrowed an axe, right, to chop down a tree. And we have to also remember the context here that an axe head would have been extremely valuable, worth a lot of money. And as he's in the process of swinging to chop down the tree, the axe head wasn't on the handle properly, and whoosh, and wouldn't you know, it flies off, splosh, into the Jordan River. The prophet cries out, oh no, what am I going to do? Now he's in tremendous debt to the person that he's borrowed the axe head from. But Elisha says, it's okay. And he gets a stick and he kind of puts it in where the axe head was, and he raises the axe head up out of the water onto the surface and tells the prophet to grab it. And you might be thinking, well, how does that translate to Jesus? I don't remember Jesus raising no axe head anywhere. Well, he didn't do that, but he did defy gravity, didn't he? And he did walk on water. And you may remember that story. In fact, it happened right after the feeding of the 5,000. And Jesus insisted that his disciples get in the boat and leave, right? And maybe behind the scenes there's that whole thing that the people were trying to make him king, right? Because they thought, oh, we can have Jesus as our king, and then there won't be any scarcity. But they were kind of thinking for the wrong reasons. And I don't know if the disciples were involved in that or not, but Jesus sends them off in the boat by themselves. And he goes up a mountain to pray. And I can imagine as they left, they were kind of excited about the whole thing as they were rowing away, that it's just going to be a matter of time, right, before Jesus really is king. And we won't have to worry about nothing. It strikes me that we all kind of set sail on the voyage of our lives, and we create a kind of safe vessel for us to do that in, right? We kind of create a worldview, we create ideals, we have certain things that we rely on to kind of navigate our way across the seas of life. And we think that if we were to get out of that boat that we kind of create to navigate across the seas of life, then we will just sink like a stone, sink like an axe head. And so we don't want to leave those boats at all, right? Whether that's our worldview or maybe that's our technology today, right? We don't have axe heads. Well, we do have axe heads. But most people use computers and phones and internet and all those kinds of things, right? And that's kind of what we sail across the sea of life on today, isn't it? And we don't want to leave those things behind because we would just sink like a stone. So the disciples are out there, and it's now the middle of the night. It's like 3 o'clock in the morning, actually. Pitch black, right? Maybe just a hint of moon. The wind has picked up. The sea is rough. And they're struggling to make any headway whatsoever. And they look across the water, and there is this shadowy figure walking across the water. Well, I don't know what you would think if you were out there in the middle of the night and you saw a shadowy figure walking across the water. You'd probably have a little fit too, right? Been watching 1-2 movie too many. But no, it's really there, right? And so they cried out. They thought it was a ghost, an apparition, because it was outside their worldview. It didn't fit. It's like their boat wasn't big enough to contain that, right? But it turns out it's Jesus. And Jesus says, don't be afraid, it's me. And then, of course, good old Peter, well, if it's you, Lord, call me out to walk on the water, if it's you. And Jesus says, come on out, Peter. And Peter does, doesn't he? He steps out of the boat. He abandons everything that he has relied on his whole life long, all the trips that he's made during his life across the Sea of Galilee, that vessel that he's relied on his whole life, he steps away from that, doesn't he? And he leaves that behind as he puts his faith in Christ. And he actually walks on the water. I know he doesn't do it for long, right? But he does it for a while. The Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann says that this is what the church should be doing, calling the world away from its reliance on technology, on all the other things the world puts its reliance on, to see a new reality of faith. And that's what Jesus does. And it's something for us to all consider this morning. What have we constructed in our lives? What are we reliant on other than Jesus that we will be scared to get out of and walk on the water? There's a lot of things, I reckon. But I reckon technology is a big one, isn't it? You may have noticed with the story of my dad that I had to ask the restaurant owner to ring for an ambulance Because it was actually in the days, I know it's hard for you guys to believe, in the days when there were no mobile phones, there was nothing. There was one phone in that restaurant, and it was attached to a wall with a cord. And he had complete authority. Oh, yeah, and that was it too. It was a dial. It was a rotary phone as well. I'm showing my age here now. But what would it be like, for us to go back to that? How will we ever survive? Well, I mean, we did survive somehow. And I'm not for one moment suggesting that we go back to that either, because I'm not sure that I would like that either. But maybe it's good for us to remember, what is it that we rely on? What is it that we've constructed in our lives to navigate across the sea of life? What is it that we would be really reluctant to get out of and walk on the water? James says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. You see, we have this great opportunity this morning, and this great opportunity today and this next week to kind of leave the world's reliance behind and walk in faith, and that's a miraculous thing to do today. And when we do that, we point to Jesus. We live in a community that desperately needs people to stand in the gap. We live in a toxic place, right? There's a lot of poison going around. There's a big focus on scarcity. And we have all these things that we rely on. But we have the opportunity, when we look around, to be the antidote, to be salt in a saltless world, to point to the abundance of God in the face of scarcity, and step out of our boats in faith and walk on the water.